One good thing about living in Georgia is that there are many outdoor activities available. I often used to go hiking and camping away from the city to refresh my mind, which gave me a sense of peace and a pleasant feeling. One day I decided to escape the hustle and bustle of city life for a peaceful day of camping, and I chose a spot deep in the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Trail. That day the weather was cloudy, with a grayish sky and distant mountains. Where I set up my camp, there were tall trees, and my happiness knew no bounds. This peace is not felt in city life. I set up my camp and gathered firewood so that I could have enough wood before nightfall. At that moment, I needed nothing. I was completely absorbed in nature. I prepared barbecue and enjoyed drinking and spent my night peacefully. The next morning, I decided to go hiking early in the morning. The path was very beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the leafy trees and birds singing. But as the day went on, dark clouds began to gather. I thought it would be better to head back to camp so that I wouldn't get soaked in the rain. When I returned to camp, it had started to rain lightly. I quickly put my belongings inside the tent. Then the rain intensified, and I sat in one corner of the tent. The raindrops from outside were falling on my tent, and I was absorbed in listening to them when I heard a strange sound. This sound was not from the wind or trees, but rather the sound of something falling. At first, I ignored it, but when the noise increased, my heart started to race. I felt like someone was there, but there was no one around where I had set up camp. I was completely alone there. This thought sent a wave of fear through my body. There were no campers. I opened the tent flap to look outside, but all I could see was darkness and shadows. My mind was racing. Was it some animal or something else? I picked up my flashlight and shone it outside. The light from my flashlight only reached the trees, but the sound was still coming. Now I realized that this was not a natural sound. Rather, something was approaching me. My heart was pounding in my chest. I gathered a bit of courage and thought I should step outside the tent to see what was going on. I gripped my flashlight tightly and slowly made my way out of the camp. I walked cautiously, scanning the area around me. After moving a few meters from the camp, I realized I couldn't see anything unusual. Feeling a bit relieved, I turned to head back to the safety of my tent. But as I approached, a chilling sight made my legs tremble with fear. A man in tattered, old clothes was trying to force his way into my tent. When our eyes met, an icy dread washed over me. His face was haunting, framed by long, unkempt hair that hung over his eyes. The look of surprise on his face mirrored my own terror. In that moment, time seemed to freeze as we stared at each other, both frozen in shock and fear. I noticed that he seemed frightened and took a step back. I thought perhaps he was just a poor man searching for food, a desperate soul in need. I asked him, "Who are you?" He replied that he was lost and had nothing to eat or drink. I gestured for him to come closer, and we both took shelter under a nearby tree, where the rain wasn't as heavy. I offered him some food and water, and we sat there in silence, absorbing the surreal nature of the moment. Despite the fear that had initially gripped me, I felt a sense of compassion for this stranger. We were two souls caught in an unexpected situation, seeking comfort from the storm around us. I told him to stay here while I went back to the tent to get him something. I grabbed some energy drinks, and when I returned, he was gone, as if he had never been there at all. I couldn't help but wonder, was he really a lost hiker, or did he have some sinister intent? Trusting a stranger was not something I could easily do, and panic washed over me. Anything could happen in that dark, isolated place. I never learned who he was or why he had been there. That night, fear kept me awake. I tried to sleep but found it impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the thought crept into my mind, what if he wanted to harm me? I lay there with one eye half open, listening for any sound that might signal his return, my heart racing with anxiety. The next morning, I packed my belongings and decided to leave the camp. A strange feeling of dread lingered in my heart. The trees stood tall around me, their shadows stretching ominously. When I finally reached my vehicle, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I got in and drove away, vowing to myself that I would never go camping alone again. A few weeks later, I read a news article about a man who had been stalking people in the very same forest where I had camped. Reports surfaced of him stealing belongings and harassing campers, which ultimately led to his arrest. The news sent chills down my spine. I had come so close to that man. Although he hadn't harmed me, his face lingered in my mind for days. The realization that I had encountered someone so dangerous left me unsettled. I decided to go camping there in a remote forest filled with trees where I could escape the noise and crowds. I packed my gear, including food, water, and a flashlight. My heart was filled with joy at the thought of spending a few days alone, lost in my thoughts in nature's tranquility. As I walked towards the forest, everything around me felt incredibly beautiful. The towering trees, swaying gently in the breeze, and the sweet melodies of birds filled the air. I set up my tent by the riverbank where the soothing sound of flowing water created a peaceful atmosphere. The first day was absolutely wonderful. I cooked my meals, sat by the river to reflect, and later built a fire at night. The warmth and glow of the flames provided a comforting ambiance, making my evening feel serene. I felt completely at peace, surrounded by nature and free from the distractions of everyday life. As the night began to deepen, I started to feel something strange. The forest had become very quiet. Every now and then, I heard sounds that seemed like someone was breaking branches or a small animal was moving quietly. I thought perhaps these were just my thoughts, but still, I felt a sense of restlessness. With the depth of the night, the sounds became even stranger. Sometimes I felt as if someone was wandering around my tent. My heart started to race, and I kept wondering whether it was just my imagination or something else. I picked up my flashlight and decided to look outside. But when I stepped out, there was only darkness and trees all around. Still, the sounds did not stop. They were always around me. The next day, when morning came, I thought that perhaps everything from the night was just my own imagination due to fear. I explored a bit and saw an old signboard that had something written on it. When I looked closely, it was a warning sign about bears. That sign frightened me. Bears? Are they really in this forest? I thought I should gather my things and leave this place. I hurriedly packed my belongings as quickly as I could, leaving some items behind. I started to feel that the animal didn't necessarily have to attack at night. It could come during the day as well. My fear was increasing. I had chosen a spot that was isolated, with no other campers around. I left behind anything that wasn't essential, including some food and drink items. A few months later, while I was scrolling through my mobile, I read a news article. A camper who had gone into the same forest had gone missing. The news also mentioned that this person had ignored the warning signs about wild animals and had disappeared from there. This news sent a wave of fear through my stomach, making me realize how lucky I was to have escaped from the jaws of death. I wonder if that missing person is still out there. Is he alive or has he died? The silence of that night still haunts me. During my college winter break, I went to stay with my cousins in a small town called Dahlonega in Georgia. It was a quiet little town, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to get away from the busy college life for a while. However, I had no idea that I was about to experience one of the most terrifying moments of my life. One night, my cousins and I went to a friend's house. This house was far from town, located in a deserted area that passed through the Appalachian Trail and was surrounded by dense, dark woods. We had a great time, laughing and sharing stories. As the night went on, it was time to head home. My cousins wanted to stay longer, but I was tired and decided to go back alone. I had no idea what was about to happen to me. Coming from the city, I wasn't familiar with these woods. It had gotten dark by the time I started my walk back, and I could only remember the path we had taken earlier. As I walked, the sound of leaves crunching under my feet echoed in the stillness, making me feel as if I was the only one there. The cold air brushed against my face, but I didn't mind it. I remembered the path well. As I entered the jungle, the trees began to close in around me. The moonlight struggled to filter through the leaves. My breaths were scattered like smoke, and there was silence all around, broken only by the occasional whisper of the wind. Suddenly, I spotted a shadow on the path. I was startled because I hadn't expected anyone else to be here. The shadow was tall and wearing a dark coat. As I got closer, I saw that he was wearing a mask that completely obscured his face, leaving only his eyes visible. "Hello!" I called out and waved my hand. But he stood there silently, staring at me. A chill ran down my spine. Who was this person? Why was he standing here? My heart began to race. I considered turning back, but I was already in the middle of the path. Trying to keep calm, I quickly walked past him, but I felt his gaze on me. My steps quickened, almost turning into a run as the forest grew darker around me. With every sound, my heartbeat intensified. Then suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. A chill ran through my veins like a sheet of ice. I didn't dare to look back. I just kept walking faster. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, as if someone was following me. I pushed myself to run with all my strength. My breaths became ragged, and my legs felt heavy, but I couldn't stop. In the distance, I saw the light from my cousin's house. I urged myself to go faster, imagining what would happen if that figure caught up to me. Finally, I burst out of the jungle and into the yard. The footsteps stopped. I turned around to look, but there was no one there. The path was empty, just dark trees and shadows. I ran toward the door and began pounding on it desperately. "What happened?" they asked, noticing the fear on my face. "There was someone in the jungle," I said, gasping for breath. "He was following me." My cousins immediately went outside to check, but found nothing. The path was empty, and the forest had fallen silent again. They reassured me that it was probably just someone else heading home, but I couldn't shake off that feeling of fear. I spent that night in a state of anxiety. Every sound made me jump. I kept replaying the image of that man standing silently in the woods. His eyes were cold and empty. The next morning, I developed a fever due to the fear. I had never experienced anything like this before. My vacation turned into a time of exhaustion and headaches instead of enjoyment and adventure. At such a young age, I faced the terrifying reality of death. I could never know who that man was or what his intentions were. But one thing is certain, I will never go back to that jungle again. During the winter days, my friends and I planned a camping trip to Clingman's Dome, which is the highest point on the Appalachian Trail. We had been looking forward to this winter camping trip for weeks, sharing plenty of pictures in our group to decide on the location, and everyone agreed to go there. We loaded our essential gear and set off for the journey. The trip itself was quite exhausting, but we were excited to enjoy a full weekend of rest. We set up our tents in a remote area of the campsite, where the solitude was a welcome relief. There were only a few other campers around, a young couple down the road and an older man at the other end. Everything seemed perfect until my girlfriend, who was rummaging through her backpack, suddenly froze and pointed down the path. "Look," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I turned to see a woman from the couple approaching us. She looked disturbed and angry, with wild hair and a vacant expression in her eyes. Her skin was pale, almost as if she had been scratching at it uncomfortably. She introduced herself, her voice monotone and distant. While she seemed friendly enough, something about her demeanor sent a chill down my spine. Her boyfriend stood a few paces behind her, lurking at the edge of the forest. He was just watching us, silently, unnervingly, and I could feel the tension rising. I tried to engage her in conversation, but my eyes kept darting to the boyfriend, who showed no signs of moving or speaking. He was just standing there, staring at us. His body language was quite strange, as if he was about to do something threatening. Eventually, the woman excused herself and walked back to her boyfriend, who was now leaning against their car, the headlights illuminating the campsite with an intense glare. My friends and I exchanged worried glances, but we decided to brush it off. After all, we were here to enjoy our weekend. Later that night, as we gathered around our fire, I felt a growing sense of unease. We heard muffled voices drifting from the couple's direction, escalating into a full-blown argument. I tried to focus on the warmth of the flames, but the screaming sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, they were shouting at each other loudly, and their voices echoed through the night. Just as we were listening to this commotion, the sound of glass shattering reached our ears, cutting through the darkness like a knife. "What was that?" one of my friends asked, his eyes wide. "I don't know, but it doesn't sound good," I replied, my heart racing. We all sat in silence, debating whether we should intervene. Just then, we heard the couple's car start up and peel away from the campsite, gravel flying as it tore down the road. My girlfriend and I looked at each other, our hearts pounding. A few moments later, we could hear the woman sobbing loudly from their campsite. It was a haunting sound, and my instinct was to check on her, but something held me back. Fear. Then, as if the night couldn't get any worse, we heard a loud shout followed by two distinct pops that echoed through the woods. Gunshots. My blood turned cold. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely able to breathe. My girlfriend nodded, her eyes wide with fear. We huddled closer, frozen in place inside the tent, listening to the chaos unfolding outside. The shouting continued, mixed with the sound of heavy footsteps approaching our direction. We held our breaths, straining to hear through the fabric walls of our tent. It was such a moment of fear that it felt like something was about to go wrong for us as well. The arguing finally died down, and an eerie silence settled over the campsite. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins as we eventually drifted into a fitful sleep. When morning light finally broke, I woke up to an empty campsite. I poked my head outside, half expecting to see the couple still there, but they were gone. I turned to my friends, who were already stirring, and asked if they had heard everything that happened during the night. "Yeah, we couldn't sleep a wink," one of them said, shaking his head. "What was that all about?" We quickly packed up our gear, all feeling a sense of urgency to leave the area. As we made breakfast, the older man from the other campsite approached us. He looked surprised to see my girlfriend and said something that sent another wave of unease through me. "You shouldn't have brought her along. It ain't safe for a woman out here." I exchanged nervous glances with my friends, our earlier excitement now a distant memory. After that unsettling conversation, we decided to move to a different area of the park, one that felt safer and far removed from the chaos of the night before. This was the worst and most chilling experience I had while camping on the Appalachian Trail. The sounds of the couple fighting and that man's unsettling face constantly reminded me of the terrifying camping experience we had endured.